you have given a set of lectures on Nietzsche as part of the new Peterson Academy. And the lectures were powerful. There's some element of the contradictions, the tensions, the drama, the way you like lock in on an idea, but then are struggling with that idea. All of that feels like it's a Nietzschean.
Yeah, well, he's a big influence on me stylistically and like in terms of the way I approached writing. And also many of the people that were other influences of mine were very influenced by him. So I was blown away when I first came across his writings. They're so intellectually dense that I don't know if there's anything that approximates that. Dostoevsky maybe, although he's much more wordy. Nietzsche is very succinct, partly because he was so ill, because he would think all day. He couldn't spend a lot of time writing, and he condensed his writings into very short, this aphoristic style he had, and it's really something to strive for. And then he's also an exciting writer, like Dostoevsky, and dynamic and romantic in that emotional way. And so it's really something. And I really enjoyed I did that lecture that you described. That lecture series is on the first half of Beyond Good and Evil, which is a stunning book. And that was really fun to take pieces of it and then to describe what they mean and how they've echoed across the decades since he wrote them. And yeah, it's been great.
Taking each sentence seriously and deconstructing it and really struggling with it. I think underpinning that approach to writing requires deep respect for the person. I think if we approach writing with that kind of respect, you can take Orwell, you can take a lot of writers and really dig in on singular sentences.
Yeah, well, those are the great writers, because the greatest writers, virtually everything they wrote is worth attending to. And I think Nietzsche is in some ways the ultimate exemplar of that, because often when I read a book, I'll mark one way or another. I often fold the corner of the page over to indicate something that I've found that's worth remembering. I couldn't do that with a book like Beyond Good and Evil, because every page ends up marked. And that's in marked contrast, so to speak, to many of the books I read now, where it's quite frequently now that I'll read a book and there won't be an idea in it that I haven't come across before. And with a thinker like Nietzsche, that's just not the case at the sentence level. And I don't think there's anyone that I know of who did that to a greater extent than he did. So there's other people whose thought is of equivalent value. I've returned recently, and I'm going to do a course to the work of this Romanian historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, who's not nearly as well known as he should be, and whose work, by the way, is a real antidote to the postmodern, nihilistic, Marxist stream of literary interpretation that the universities as a whole have adopted. And Eliade is like that too. I used this book called The Sacred and the Profane quite extensively in a book that I'm releasing in mid-November, We Who Wrestle with God, and it's of the same sort. It's endlessly analyzable. Eliade walked through the whole history of religious ideas, and he had the intellect that enabled him to do that, and everything he wrote is dreamlike in its density. So every sentence or paragraph is evocative in an image-rich manner, and that also, what would you say, deepens and broadens the scope. And that's part of often what distinguishes writing that has a literary end from writing that's more merely technical. Like the literary writings have this imagistic and dreamlike reference space around them. And it takes a long time to turn a complex image into something semantic. And so if your writing evokes deep imagery, it has a depth that can't be captured merely in words. And the great romantic poetic philosophers, Nietzsche is a very good example, Dostoevsky is a good example, so is Mircea Eliade. They have that quality. And it's a good way of thinking about it. It's kind of interesting from the perspective of technical analysis of intelligence. There's a good book called The User Illusion, which is the best book on consciousness that I ever read. It explains the manner in which our communication is understandable in this manner. So imagine that when you're communicating something, you're trying to change the way that your target audience perceives and acts in the world. So that's an embodied issue. But you're using words which aren't when obviously aren't equivalent to the actions themselves. You can imagine that the words are surrounded by a cloud of images that they evoke, and that the images can be translated into actions. Yeah, and the greatest writing uses words in a manner that evokes images that profoundly affects perception and action. And so I would take the manner in which I act and behave, I would translate that into a set of images. My dreams do that for me, for example. Then I compress them into words. I toss you the words, you decompose them, decompress them into the images and then into the actions. And that's what happens in a meaningful conversation. It's a very good way of understanding how we communicate linguistically.
So if the words spring to the full visual complexity, and then that can then transform itself into action.
Yes, and change in perception. Because
change in perception.
Well, those are both relevant. And it's an important thing to understand, because the classic empiricists make the presumption, and it's an erroneous presumption, that perception is a value-free enterprise. And they assume that partly because they think of perception as something passive. You just turn your head and you look at the world and there it is. It's like, perception is not passive. There is no perception without action, ever, ever. And that's a weird thing to understand, because even when you're looking at something, like your eyes are moving back and forth, if they ever stop moving for a tenth of a second, you stop being able to see. So your eyes are jiggling back and forth just to keep them active. And then there's involuntary movements of your eyes. And then there's voluntary movements of your eyes. Like, what you're doing with your eyes is very much like what a blind person would do if they were feeling out the contours of an object. You're sampling, and you're only sampling a small element of the space that's in front of you. And the element that you choose to sample is dependent on your aims and your goals. So it's value saturated. And so all your perceptions are action predicated. And partly what you're doing when you're communicating is therefore not only changing people's actions, let's say, but you're also changing the strategy that they use to perceive. And so you change the way the world reveals itself for them. See, this is why it's such a profound experience to read a particularly deep thinker, because you could also think of your perceptions as the axioms of your thought. That's a good way of thinking about it. A perception is like what would you say? It's a thought that's so set in concrete that you now see it rather than conceptualize it. A really profound thinker changes the way you perceive the world. That's way deeper than just how you think about it or how you feel about it.
What about not just profound thinkers, but thinkers that deliver a powerful idea? For example, utopian ideas of Marx, or utopian ideas, you could say dystopian ideas of Hitler. Those ideas are powerful, and they can saturate all your perception with values, and they focus you in a way where there's only a certain set of actions.
Yeah, right. Even a certain set of emotions as well.
And it's intense and it's direct, and they're so powerful that they completely alter the perception, and the words spring to life.
Yeah, it's like a form of possession. So there's two things you need to understand to make that clear. The first issue is that, as we suggested or implied, that perception is action predicated, but action is goal predicated, right? You act towards a goal. And these propagandistic thinkers that you described, they attempt to unify all possible goals into a coherent singularity. And there's advantages of that. There's the advantage of simplicity, for example, which is a major advantage. And there's also the advantage of motivation, right? So if you provide people with a simple manner of integrating all their actions, you decrease their anxiety and you increase their motivation. Now, that can be a good thing if the unifying idea that you put forward is valid, but it's the worst of all possible ideas if you put forward an invalid unifying idea. And then you might say, well, how do you distinguish between a valid unifying idea and an invalid unifying idea? Now, Nietzsche was very interested in that, and I don't think he got that exactly right. But the postmodernists, for example, especially the ones, and this is most of them with the neo-Marxist bent, their presumption is that the fundamental unifying idea is power, that everything's about compulsion and force, essentially, and that that's the only true unifying ethos of mankind, which is, I don't know if there's a worse idea than that. I mean, there are ideas that are potentially as dangerous. The nihilistic idea is pretty dangerous, although it's more of a disintegrating notion than a unifying idea. The hedonistic idea that you live for pleasure, for example, that's also very dangerous. But if you wanted to go for sheer pathology, the notion that, and this is Foucault in a nutshell, and Marx for that matter, that power rules everything, not only is that a terrible unifying idea, but it fully justifies your own use of power. And I don't mean the power Nietzsche talks about. His will to power was more his insistence that a human being is an expression of will rather than a mechanism of self-protection and security. Like, he thought of the life force in human beings as something that strived not to protect itself, but to exhaust itself in being and becoming. It's like an upward oriented motivational drive, even towards meaning. Now, he called it the will to power, and that had some unfortunate consequences. At least that's how it's translated. But he didn't mean the power motivation that people like Foucault or Marx became so hung up on.
So it's not power like you're trying to destroy the other. It's power, full flourishing of a human being, the creative force of a human being. In that way.
You could imagine that, and you could imagine that you could segregate competence and ability. Like, imagine that you and I were going to work on a project. We could organize our project in relationship to the ambition that we wanted to attain, and we can organize an agreement so that you were committed to the project voluntarily, and so that I was committed to the project voluntarily. So that means that we would actually be united in our perceptions and our actions by the motivation of something approximating voluntary play. Now, you could also imagine another situation where I said, here's our goal, and you better help me or I'm going to kill your family. Well, the probability is that you would be quite motivated to undertake my bidding. And so then you might say, well, that's how the world works. It's power and compulsion. But the truth of the matter is that you can force people to see things your way, let's say, but it's nowhere near as good a strategy, even practically, than the strategy that would be associated with something like voluntary joint agreement of pattern of movement strategy towards a goal. See, this is such an important thing to understand because it helps you start to understand the distinction between a unifying force that's based on power and compulsion and one that is much more in keeping, I would say, with the ethos that governs Western societies, free Western societies. There's really a qualitative difference, and it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So if we just look at the nuance of Nietzsche's thought, the idea he first introduced, and thus spoke Zarathustra, of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
It's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his sister after his death. Yeah. But I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because people tend to think of that as a triumphalist statement. But Nietzsche actually said that he really said something like the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view, and that there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity is high. Fractionation of your goals, so that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be because there's many things competing for your attention, and also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, and you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people in the upcoming 20th century. Like he could see that coming 50 years earlier. And Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book, The Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche. Because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, a clear unity, within ourselves, let's say, then we could turn to ourselves for that discovery. But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like, well, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? Like you're a war of competing motivations. Or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? I mean, you know, it's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course, Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well.
Okay, but if we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people.
Yeah.
Because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, or perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub-themes in the Gospels is the sub-theme of the Pharisees. And so the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations. We're seeing this happen online. Like one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right-wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of what would you say, cliches like Christ is king, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of emerging right-wing pathology. Right-wing. The political dimension isn't the right dimension of analysis, but it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so that's another thing that I tried to detail out in these lectures, but also in this new book. It's like, how do you tell the good actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the religious problem, and that's what the communists say all the time. The modern day communists are like, real communism has never been tried, and you could say, I suppose, with some justification, you could say that real Christianity has never been tried because we always fall short of the ideal mark. And so, I mean, my rejoinder to the communists is something like, every single time it's been implemented, wherever it's been implemented, regardless of the culture and the background of the people who've implemented it, it's had exactly the same catastrophic consequences. It's like, I don't know how many examples you need of that, but I believe we've generated sufficient examples so that that case is basically resolved. Now, the general rejoinder to that is, it's really something like, well, if I was in charge of the communist enterprise, the utopia would have come about. Right? But that's also a form of dangerous pretense. Part of the way, see, that problem is actually resolved to some degree in the developing notion of sacrifice that emerges in the Western canon over thousands and thousands of years. So one of the suggestions, for example, and this is something exemplified in the Passion story, is that you can tell the valid holder of an idea because that holder will take the responsibility for the consequences of his idea onto himself. And that's why, for example, you see one way of conceptualizing Christ in the gospel story is as the ultimate sacrifice to God. So you might ask, well, what's the ultimate sacrifice? And there are variants of an answer to that. One form of ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of a child, the offering of a child, and the other is the offering of the self. And the story of Christ brings both of those together because he's the Son of God that's offered to God. And so it's an archetypal resolution of that tension between ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate because once you're a parent, most parents would rather sacrifice themselves than their children, right? So you have something that becomes of even more value than yourself. But the sacrifice of self is also a very high order level of sacrifice. Christ is an archetype of the pattern of being that's predicated on the decision to offer everything up to the highest value, right? That pattern of self-sacrifice. And I think part of the reason that's valid is because the person who undertakes to do that pays the price themselves. It's not externalized. They're not trying to change anyone else, except maybe by example. It's your problem. And that, like Solzhenitsyn pointed that out too. When he was struggling with the idea of good versus evil. And you see this in more sophisticated literature, in really unsophisticated literature or drama. There's a good guy and the bad guy, and the good guy's all good, and the bad guy's all bad. And in more sophisticated literature, the good and bad are abstracted. You can think of them as spirits, and then those spirits possess all the characters in the complex drama to a greater or lesser degree, and that battle is fought out both socially and internally. In the high-order religious conceptualizations in the West, if they culminate, let's say, in the Christian story, the notion is that battle between good and evil is fundamentally played out as an internal drama.
Yeah, so for a religious ethos, the battle between good and evil is fought within each individual human heart.
Right. It's your moral duty to constrain evil within yourself. And well, there's more to it than that, because there's also the insistence that if you do that, that makes you the most effective possible, like, warrior, let's say, against evil itself in the social world. That you start with the battle that occurs within you, in the soul, let's say. The soul becomes the battleground between the forces of good and evil. The idea that there's an idea there too, which is if that battle is undertaken successfully, then it doesn't have to be played out in the social world as actual conflict, right? You can rectify the conflict internally without it having to be played out as fate, as Jung put it.
So what would you say to Nietzsche, who called Christianity the slave morality? And his critique of religion in that way was slave morality versus master morality. And then you put in Ubermensch into that.
See, I would say that the woke phenomenon is the manifestation of the slave morality that Nietzsche criticized, and that there are elements of Christianity that can be gerrymandered to support that mode of perception and conception. But I think he was wrong in his essential criticism of Christianity in that regard. Now, it's complicated with Nietzsche because Nietzsche never criticizes the gospel stories directly. What he basically criticizes is something like the pathologies of institutionalized religion. And I would say most particularly of the, what would you say, of the sort of casually too nice Protestant form. You know, that's a thumbnail sketch and perhaps somewhat unfair, but given the alignment, let's say, of the more mainstream Protestant movements with the woke mob, I don't think it's an absurd criticism. And it's something like the degeneration of Christianity into the notion that good and harmless are the same thing, or good and empathic are the same thing, which is simply not true and far too simplified. And I also think Nietzsche was extremely wrong in his presumption that human beings should take it to themselves to construct their own values. I think he made a colossal error in that presumption.
And that is the idea of the Ubermensch, that the great individual, the best of us, should create our own values.
Well, and I think the reason that he was wrong about that is that, so when God gives instructions to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he basically tells them that they can do anything they want in the walled garden. So that's the kind of balance between order and nature that makes up the human environment. Human beings have the freedom vouchsafed to them by God to do anything they want in the garden except to mess with the most fundamental rule. So God says to people, you're not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which fundamentally means there is an implicit moral order and you're to abide by it. Your freedom stops at the foundation. And you can think about that. I'd be interested even in your ideas about this as an engineer, let's say, is that there is an ethos that's implicit in being itself. And your ethos has to be a reflection of that. And that isn't under your control. You can't gerrymander the foundation because your foundational beliefs have to put you in harmony, like musical harmony, with the actual structure of reality as such. So I can give you an example of that. So our goal, insofar as we're conducting ourselves properly, is to have the kind of interesting conversation that allows both of us to express ourselves in a manner that enables us to learn and grow, such that we can share that with everyone who's listening. And if our aim is true and upward, then that's what we're doing. Well, that means that we're going to have to match ourselves to a pattern of interaction, and that's marked for us emotionally. Like you and I both know this. If we're doing this right, we're going to be interested in the conversation. We're not going to be looking at our watch. We're not going to be thinking about what we're aiming at. We're just going to communicate. Now, the religious interpretation of that would be that we were doing something like making the redemptive logos manifest between us in dialogue. And that's something that can be shared. To do that, we have to align with that pattern. I can't decide that there's some arbitrary way that I'm going to play you. I mean, I could do that if I was a psychopathic manipulator, but to do that optimally, I'm not going to impose a certain mode of a certain a priori aim, let's say, on our communication and manipulate you into that. So the constraints on my ethos reflect the actual structure of the world. And I can't, this is the communist presumption. It's like, we're going to burn everything down and we're going to start from scratch. And we've got these axiomatic presumptions and we're going to put them into place and we're going to socialize people so they now think and live like communists from day one. And human beings are infinitely malleable. And we can use a rational set of presuppositions to decide what sort of beings they should be. The transhumanists are doing this too. It's like, no, there's a pattern of being that you have to fall into alignment with. And I think it's the pattern of being, by the way, that if you fall into alignment with, it gives you hope. It protects you from anxiety, and it gives you a sense of harmony with your surroundings and with other people. And none of that's arbitrary.
But don't you think we both arrived to this conversation with rigid axioms that we have? Maybe we're blind to them, but in the same way that the Marxists came with very rigid axioms about the way the world is and the way it should be, aren't we coming to that?
Well, we definitely come to the conversation with a hierarchy of foundational axioms, right? And I would say the more sophisticated you are as a thinker, the deeper the level at which you're willing to play. So imagine first that you have presumptions of different depth. There's more predicated on the more fundamental axioms, and then that there's a space of play around those. And that space of play is going to depend on the sophistication of the player, obviously. But those who are capable of engaging in deeper conversations talk about more fundamental things with more play. Now, we have to come to the conversation with a certain degree of structure because we wouldn't be able to understand each other or communicate if a lot of things weren't already assumed or taken for granted.
How rigid is the hierarchy of axioms that religion provides? This is what I'm trying to understand. The rigidity of that hierarchy.
It's as rigid as play.
Well, play is not rigid at all.
No. It's got a rigidity.
There's some constraints.
It took me about 40 years to figure out the answer to that question. So it wasn't, I'm serious about that. So it wasn't a random answer. So play is very rigid in some ways. So like if you and I go out to play basketball or chess, like there are rules and you can't break the rules because then you're no longer in the game. But then there's a dynamism within those rules that's, well, with chess, it's virtually infinite. I mean, I think, what is it? There's more patterns of potential games on a chessboard than there are subatomic particles in the observable universe. Like it's an insane space. So it's not like there's not freedom within it. But it's a weird paradox in a way, isn't it? Because music is like this too, is that there are definitely rules. And there are things, you can't throw a basketball into a chess board and still be playing chess. But weirdly enough, if you adhere to the rules, the realm of freedom increases rather than decreasing. And I think you can make the same case for a playful conversation. It's like we're playing by certain rules and a lot of them are implicit, but that doesn't mean that, it might mean the reverse of constraint, because in this seminar, for example, that I was referring to, the Exodus seminar and then the Gospel seminar, everybody in the seminar, there's about 8 of us, played fair. Nobody used power. Nobody tried to prove they were right. They put forward their points, but they were like, here's a way of looking at that. Assess it. And they were also doing it genuinely. It's like, this is what I've concluded about, say, this story. And I'm going to make a case for it, but I'd like to hear what you have to say because maybe you can change it, you can extend it, you can find a flaw in it. And that's a conversation that has flow and that's engaging and that other people will listen to as well. And that's also, I think that one of the things that we can conclude now, and we can do this even from a neuroscientific basis, is that sense of engaged meaning is a marker not only for the emergence of harmony between you and your environment, but for the emergence of that harmony in a way that is developmentally rich, that moves you upward towards, what would you say? Well, I think towards a more effective entropic state. That's actually the technical answer to that. But it makes you more than you are. And there's a directionality in that.